Hello class, my name is Josh Caldwell, and today I'm going to be discussing Hessian mercenaries of the Revolutionary War. Now, my research on this topic was pretty interesting. There are hundreds of diaries written by Hessian soldiers as original sources, but there are also sources from both the British and the American military. The first thing that I found to be truly startling was the fact that the Hessians aren't really Hessians. They actually come from 7 different principalities, and it's the 2 larger ones that are Hesse Castle and Hesse Hanau that contributed the majority of the troops. So they kind of fell into a catch-all term. What I found even ironically more interesting than that was the fact that they weren't all Europeans. In fact, there were 135 African American troops who enlisted as replacements for the Hessians and fought as Hessians. They also were not mercenaries. The term mercenary implies a soldier who hires himself out to somebody, but what they correctly were was they were auxiliaries, and they were an entire military formation in part of their prince's army, and their prince's army was hired out without the consent of the soldier at all. The Hessians themselves had a long history of being hired out by the English. Dates back to the Middle Ages, and it was quite active during the 18th century. They had been hired to protect the English from the Scottish, they'd been hired to protect them from the French, and they were hired and deployed to augment the British military. Now, the British didn't see any sense in having their own big standing army. So what they did is they basically created a cottage industry for the German principalities, where the German principalities were able to build and hire out large armies as basically the business of war. And this was really the way that the German groups rebuilt their economy after the devastation they had been through in the 30 Years' War earlier and then the 7 Years' War. And they really relied on the business of war as the basis for their entire economy. They had a very integrated conscription process where as early as 7 years old, boys would show up at the recruiter's office to be evaluated. And they did it again at 16 years old. And every year from 16 to 30, they were evaluated both physically and for their contribution to the economy of the society. Now, if they were considered essential to the economy, they wouldn't be put in the army. Apparently, only 1 in 15 actually ended up in the army. And they were your fringe people, people who didn't have a lot going on. They didn't have any particular career or any sort of job skill. They were your outlier people. One of the most interesting things about the Hessians is their appearance. They built their own weapons. They created their own uniforms. But the Hessian uniforms featured a very tall hat to make themselves look quite tall. And they cut their coats short and their pants short so that they had the appearance of being giants walking among normal men. And there's a bunch of different diary entries that talk about the Americans fleeing as soon as they see the Hessians. And this actually played into the propaganda of the time. The American propaganda was basically that the Hessians were these bloodthirsty animals. And conversely, the propaganda that the Hessians used on their own soldiers were that the Americans would hang them if they got a hold of them for interfering in the war, and they didn't dare wander into the frontiers because the natives were cannibals. And this takes us to the last topic I really want to talk about is desertion in the end of the war. There were a large number of deserters, maybe 4,000 or 5,000. And the biggest barrier to these people staying in America was the language barrier. They came, and there's a lot of diary entries talking about how beautiful the land is and how beautiful the women are. But because most of the colonists spoke English and they spoke German, they didn't really mesh, even though they themselves were pietists and shared a religious and cultural tradition with the large groups of Germans that were living in Pennsylvania at the time. At the end of the war, the guys who didn't decide to desert or didn't find a wife and marry into some colonial family, just casually got back on boats supplied by their princes, and the colonists actually went down to the docks to wave them a fond farewell as they exited. Um, all in all, there's a lot to be learned about the historiography, the way the Hessians are presented, and they're a very interesting third party in what's usually presented as a two-party war. Thank you. My name is Josh Caldwell, and I look forward to hearing your comments.